Hello and welcome to this special dialogue series of Jindal School of International Affairs of OP Jindal Global University. I am Professor Sriram Chaulia. I am the Dean of the School of International Affairs here. And I am joined today in a discussion on a very significant topic by a very important person, Lieutenant General A.K. Singh, very distinguished who has served India with great honor for many decades, has been involved both in operations as well as in strategic planning. He has been director of perspective planning at in the Indian Army and has held positions which involve great depth in terms of their relevance for national security. So it's really a privilege for us to have General A.K. Singh with us today to take us through a kind of a voice about a rather less explored area. Now, all of us have been bombarded with news and views and opinions on coronavirus and the ongoing global health crisis, the pandemic. But these have primarily happened through two lenses. The first is public health and medicine and epidemiology and virology. We've been hearing all kinds of health experts talking about various aspects of the disease, the contagion, the casualties, the strategies to check the transmission of the disease and so on. On the other hand, there's been a lot of focus on the economic outcome and the fallout, the severe global downturn, as well as both nationally and internationally, and its repercussions for employment, for livelihoods, for businesses, for workers, marginalized communities, you name it. So there's been a lot of attention on the health and the economic aspects. But today I am engaging with General Singh on a matter which is less discussed, but which is no less salient, which is the implications of this health pandemic for national security. National security, generally, we identify with certain threats posed to a nation state, especially violent threats by rival states or by armed and aggressive non-state actors. Generally, when we talk about national security, we think in terms of this is the map of the major actors, and here are the bad guys, and how do we check them? How do we neutralize them? But this crisis is totally different. As you know, it's being called an invisible enemy. It's very different from most of the conventional and even the non-conventional threats. So it has really forced the national security community, the establishment, both in India and internationally, to reorganize itself to meet this new challenge. And it is raising important questions about whether our conventional definition of national security itself has become outdated because of this pandemic, and whether we need to expand this or maybe rediscover something that we forgot, which is actually inherent to the concept of national security, which is the well-being of citizens. I'll give you two examples before opening the discussion with General A.K. Singh. One, this adjustment, examples of this adjustment. Number one, Doval, our national security advisor, recently in March, when this super spreader event happened with the Tablighi Jamaat in Delhi, Mr. Doval apparently went at 2 a.m. at night to a mosque in Delhi to convince the Maulana Saad, who was the head of the Tablighi Jamaat, to open the premises for decontamination and for also for all the worshippers to be tested, because they were resisting this. So here is the National Security Advisor of India trying to combat a health crisis. The second example is it's been reported in the international media, is of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, the famed spy agency of Israel, has apparently been made in charge of Israel's strategy to secure medical equipment, protective gear, masks, gowns, and drugs and such things from around the world. And Mossad is not the health ministry of Israel or any civilian agency. It's actually the Mossad and the other military intelligence agencies that have been drafted by the Israeli state to tackle the pandemic. So it's not Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas. It's not Hizbul Mujahideen or Lashkar-e-Taiba, but actually a virus. And that's what our national security establishments seem to be reorienting themselves to handle. Of course, the other threats remain, and I'm going to come to that too. But the first point, General Singh, it seems to me that now simply focusing on violent actors is no longer tenable in the current environment, which threatens to be a prolonged crisis for months or years. It looks like the militaries and intelligence agencies have focused on things like biological warfare and germ warfare, and to some extent, there is a link between the traditional national security and the fear of biological terrorism and such things. But this is a completely different we are talking about. And it seems, General Singh, that are we prepared, both our national security as well as of other countries, to adjust to this? And in what ways is the definition of national security itself changed as a result of this COVID-19?
What a pleasure it is to be in talk and discussion with Dean Sriram Chaulia. And for those of you, especially from the Armed Forces fraternity who have joined in, he is one of our, apart from being Dean of the School of International Studies in Jindal Global University and a colleague there, he is one of our most distinguished foreign policy and international level experts. And more important, he contributes very regularly his views in a very credible and candid manner, both on in the print and visual media. And it may be of interest for you all to know that he's written many books, but his latest book is titled very nicely, and it is called Trump. And would recommend for, I've read the reviews because I'm still waiting for Dean Chaulia. Maybe after today's thing, if this goes well, he'll present me an autographed copy. But I would recommend to all of you to take up his book, Trump. Well, I think the topic has been chosen by Dean Chaulia, and I think it's a very, very relevant topic, because in this health crisis, we seem to be just focusing on the numbers going up, numbers going down, the expectation for a vaccine. And as he's rightly put, national security has now expanded. The traditional concept of national security, as all of us understood for many, many decades, related to the physical well-being of the nation and the state and its defense against inimical forces. But this definition, not today because of this pandemic, but over the last so many decades, certainly towards the end of the last century, has expanded. And while earlier it focused only on the state, today it focuses not only on the state, on the society, and on the individual. Now there's a subtle difference in focusing only on the state, and here I think national security requires an harmony between the state, the society, and the individual. And today, as we experience even in India, aspects like health, aspects like education, food security, water, migration have become equally relevant to national security issues. And therefore, I think it's a very good topic to have been selected. As far as threats and challenges to a nation's security are concerned, we can classify them as the traditional threats as we have known them. In the case of India, you look at a traditional threat coming from our borders in the West, Pakistan, in the North and East, China, and the non-traditional threats. And these non-traditional threats, it's not that they have emerged today. They have been there in the background for quite some time. But the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, has actually highlighted how we focus too much on the traditional threats and did not prepare ourselves for the non-traditional threats. You know, there is a lot of literature floating around that this kind of a virus or pandemic was waiting to happen. And this had been pointed out by many learned people many decades ago. But instead of ratcheting up the funding for preparing for such pandemics was actually severely curtailed. And we see the result today, that we are groping in the dark. The threats earlier could be easily classified in black and white terms. But today, shades of grey have crept in. Shades of grey have crept in, and uh, terms like hybrid warfare, grey zone warfare, non-kinetic warfare, non-contact warfare are coming to the fore. And of course, the biological dimension of the NBC. See, when we looked at, in fact, all those Fajis who are on the side would recollect that right from a young officer's days, many decades back, we were taught about nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. But I must say that our focus used to be on the nuclear with a little attention to the chemical. And biological warfare was actually given short shrift. We said, look, it is not something that it is basically a local kind of threat. It cannot influence large portions, large populations. And so it was something that we haven't prepared. You know, our civil defense, especially the health portion of civil defense against such large pandemics, and we are only talking of this biological threat. We still, if there was, God forbid, a nuclear accident, I'm not even talking of a nuclear attack, I'm talking of a nuclear accident. How prepared are we to tackle that nuclear accident is open to question. Maybe in the world you would have just 2 or 3 countries which would have some level of preparation, the United States, Russia, maybe China. Let's talk of each of these threats a little while. Hybrid threat has no consistent definition. It generally refers to deniable covert actions supported by the threat or use of force or conventional means to influence the domestic politics of the target countries. It is difficult to categorize hybrid warfare as military or quasi-military challenge, but it has elements of both military and non-military domains. The proxy war waged by Pakistan in Jammu and Kashmir for the last 2 or 3 decades is a classic example of hybrid warfare. Though we have started calling it hybrid warfare only recently. Till now, we used to just call it counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, etc. Hybrid warfare can also be termed as a strategy for creating chaos. Nation states like orderliness. Nation states, the forces which are meant to protect the nation, work in an orderly manner. Hybrid warfare wants to create chaos so that there is uncertainty, there is fear among the populace, and that actually furthers their own aims and ambitions. Another term that has come to the fore in recent times is grey zone warfare or grey zone conflict, and refers to a conceptual space between peace and war. Between peace and war. Grey zone conflict challenges moral and ethical thresholds and undermines international norms, laws of armed conflict, and ethics of warfighting. The precision attack on Saudi oil fields in September 2009 by so-called Houthi rebels is a classic case of grey zone domain. For while the attack was claimed by the Houthi rebels, we are quite certain that they were incapable of that attack, and that maybe 1 or 2 states were in the grey zone supporting them. Biological warfare is a potent tool in grey zone warfare. The jury is still out whether corona pandemic was triggered or accidental. The footprints are still hazy, and there is maybe a cover-up plan in action. There is adequate scope for deniability when you use such weapons or such threats. The coronavirus has brought the strongest countries to their knees in a matter of weeks. Therefore, the pandemic has added another dimension to this new threat in the grey zone, without inviting any military response or violating any rules of armed conflict. A classic takeaway from the Sun Tzu dictum of winning without fighting. And we don't know who's fighting whom and who's winning. To summarize, let me say that we need to take a microscopic look at non-traditional threats, from extreme climatic effects like water shortage, which we are facing in our country, to pandemics like the coronavirus, to mass displacement and migration, to transnational terrorism. And we saw a glimpse of this when large number of our migration workers wanted to go home, and there was a huge problem at hand for the state. There is an entire specter of strategic uncertainties that looms on the horizon. All this as the threats, the traditional threats we have faced and continue to face, remain unabated. So that in a nutshell is how I would look at national security and the threats and challenges we are facing.
Thank you, General Singh. I think you're right that this hybrid or gray zone is something that many of us, tend to look at it in white or black, but now there's a lot of fuzziness, and things like viruses and pandemics. Presumably, I mean, if we give the benefit of the doubt that the Chinese did not deliberately do this, because obviously their own economy has also collapsed as a result of this. Although, as you said, the jury is still out and there's a lot of unknown. But presumably, if this can be weaponized, and the same thing can be repeated over and over again by malicious actors with a deliberate motive. So very much something that needs to be factored in when we plan how to defend our own country, or any state for that matter. I think we'll need to rethink their, the basic doctrines. But moving to the conventional ones, General. So one is the virus itself, and we are talking about how these kind of, it has in a way muscled in on the consciousness of the national security community. But the other is the conventional players. Are they exploiting the global attention on the pandemic to carry on with their old dirty ways? I mean, this is something that seems to be emerging. We are hearing from around the world, including our own neighborhood, that actors which in the past have engaged in wars or intimidatory tactics or a mixture of the two are now more emboldened, because they probably think that, look, the national security as well as the entire government machineries of many countries are so preoccupied with the health crisis that now is the time to strike and to extract their pound of flesh. Is that happening? I mean, I was just reading an excellent analysis by Commodore A.J. Singh, formerly of the Indian Navy, in where he was talking about how China, for example, has become more assertive in its gunboat diplomacy in the South China Sea and in the Pacific in the last 2 months, and how China is smelling a major opportunity to push smaller countries around, and also to push the US Navy out of the region. He was mentioning how the incident on an aircraft carrier, USS Theodore Roosevelt, where hundreds of US sailors got infected by COVID-19 and had to be taken off in Guam, and how these kind of incidents have suddenly emboldened the Chinese to believe that the Americans, both in the mainland US as well as their power projection in the Pacific, are now struggling, unable to maintain their old strength, and therefore the Chinese believe that now is the time for them to push out. So even though China itself has been badly affected, both in terms of the loss of lives and the infection from coronavirus, and even though China itself was the origin of the virus, even though the Chinese economy is also flat, nonetheless, it seems like China is taking advantage of the vacuum that seems to be emerging as a result of the pandemic. And the other actor, of course, is our own neighbor on the west, Pakistan, and we have been seeing a series of more and more brazen attempts at infiltration and violent attacks in Kashmir Valley. We have recently lost a colonel and major in Handwada, and incidents continue to seem to be on the uptick as far as kinetic action by these terrorist groups sponsored by Pakistan goes. So my question generally is, has COVID-19 actually created kind of a basis for these actors, malevolent actors, to actually increase their machinations and to make matters worse? And are they sensing that this is their big chance to try and harass and hassle countries that are more inwardly focused right now with their domestic health priorities?
Well, you make a valid point, but my straight answer to this would be partly yes, partly no. And let me explain. As far as large countries, major world powers are concerned, there's a certain amount of stability in their security relationship. And short dips like this of, let's say, the US Navy not being present in the South China Sea in the same quantum that it used to be earlier is not a vacuum that is permanent and will be refilled by them as soon as they regain their footing as far as the pandemic is concerned. Let me give you an example. You talk of the US and Russia relationship. The US notified some time back that they would be sending a certain flotilla into the Bering Sea in the North Arctic Ocean, because they do not want that part of the world to be claimed by Russia alone, because these are international waters. Though Russia is very effective there, they have the best capability there. And just, I think, a couple of days back, they have sailed, I think 4 or 5 ships of United States and one of UK have sailed there, and they've been trailed by the Russian fleet. So things at that level, they understand the ramifications. Let's look at closer to China, and we'll talk of China later also. Certainly, China has been more aggressive in the South China Sea, where it has many claims and many disputes with the bordering states, to the extent that its first aircraft carrier group, China commissioned that aircraft, Liaoning or something it is called, sailed very aggressively on the east coast of Taiwan. And that was a provocative action, certainly, because they know that Taiwan is a state which is very sensitive to these moves, not Taiwan, but so the United States. They were aware that the United States has ceded some space in the South China Sea, but they have since moved away from there, and there has been no further provocations. Of course, what they have done is they've shown their flag, they have shown that they are there, and they are the ones who have the maximum clout in that area. But that clout is not uncontested. That will be contested. The American Navy has, of course, moved out because they berthed the carrier in Guam. And as soon as things become okay, they'll probably move it back towards the Pacific and the South China Sea. As far as India is concerned, the Indo-China border is, to the best of my knowledge, is quite stable. And we haven't seen any provocations there. Because Chinese understand that while India may be engaged in fighting the pandemic, our armed forces are quite firmly focused on doing their traditional jobs as well. And therefore, the Chinese Indo-China border has been quite stable. Yes, but the players who are going to take advantage and who are continuing to take advantage are the lesser states, the rogue states, if I may call them, and the non-state actors. For them, it's a good occasion to take a deep breath and expand or rejuvenate themselves and trigger episodes or incidents. And let's come to Pakistan. When we abrogated 370 and turned J&K into the Union territories, there was a constituency within the valley that wanted Pakistan to do something. Pakistan also was sort of forced to react to this constituency. But they also are mindful of the fact that after Pulwama, we unleashed Balakot. And therefore, India has created a new normal where we signal to them that our threshold has limits. And you cross our threshold, we will respond. As it is in the summer months, the valley heats up. And in the month of April, I am told we have neutralized 28, 30 terrorists in the hinterland. Many more attempts on the line of control have been neutralized. And yes, we've suffered some casualties, and I'm sure the army would look at it. It reflects that the army leadership is full go. And of course, we will probably review as to how to minimize casualties in the future in such operations. But let me say, as far as the valley is concerned, the current proxy war has been on from 1989. It's almost 3 decades now, and it has seen its ebbs and downs. There have been higher casualties. There have been more peaceful periods in between. So the Indian Armed Forces, specifically the Indian Army, is fully in control and is fully capable of keeping the security situation under control. And it does so by 3 actions. One is the deployment on the line of control itself. One is a deployment for conventional operations, that is to prevent any mischief on the borders. Second is a counter-infiltration deployment along the fence. We have created a fence all along. And third, a counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism deployment along with other forces of the state in the hinterland. So I think there is nothing to worry. Pakistan is trying its best to keep the situation alive, except that they are now also mindful and conscious that India has a threshold and that there is a new normal. Now they cannot get away by ratcheting it up beyond a certain level. Their focus has been to somehow reignite an impression that this proxy war is more domestic in nature, more linked to the domestic and the local Kashmiris. Therefore, even the Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is along with Jaish-e-Mohammed the 2 main active terrorist organizations prevalent in the country, has created a new front, the resistance front. And that is what we are seeing, trying to portray a picture that it is non-religious, it is the local sentiments against the occupation or against the presence of Indian security forces that are coming to the fore. So I would say that there is the situation, while it has got heated up a little, I think there is nothing alarming about it. And the Indian Armed Forces are perfectly in full control. And this is so much so, if you see the recent interview of the Chief of Army Staff or the Chief of Defense Staff, I think things are stable. In fact, the statement...
That's assuring to know. I am still puzzled as to how some of these states continue to invest so much in proxy wars and such things, or in geopolitical pushbacks at a time when they should ideally be focused entirely on protecting the well-being of their own citizens. I mean, there is clearly an issue of accountability in these countries, and it's not just applying to China or Pakistan, but it seems like it's a broader issue globally, where actors which were engaged in this sort of behavior before are now doing the same level or at a more higher, more enhanced level, rather than restraining themselves and focusing on the well-being. It just shows how deep the cancer of this violent activity and thinking is in some of these countries. But moving on, Gerald. Yeah. Yes, sir. You wanted a comment?
Just wanted to highlight before we move on to the next topic that there is an internal dimension to the threats we face. And we have looked at that dimension in terms of Northeast, Naxalism, Jammu and Kashmir we discussed just now. But I think there is a new dimension of new non-traditional threats that are emerging. And let's look at the recent happenings in our country. You had the CAA protests, followed by there were riots in Delhi at a very critical time when the US president was visiting us. And then in the pandemic, you have seen all kinds of activities. There was also a recent case, which I'm sure most people are aware, where anti-Muslim messages started floating in the Middle East, being linked to Indians. Now, again, this is part of gray zone warfare. These are fuzzy. You cannot pinpoint. Well, yes, you can say that the origin may have been indigenous in many cases, but to expect inimical elements, especially the Pakistan's fourth estate, to let go of the opportunity would be of optimism. Obviously, they have played along in this and heightened what were probably internal concerns. So my view is that internally we have to be careful that the divides, the religious, regional, economic, social divides that a country faces, and let's admit there are divides, we have to handle them with greater care, because the inimical forces are bound to get involved and take advantage of this. And you cannot crib it, they will take advantage. However much the state will fight them. So we have to get our own house also in order. I think that is very much true.
Point well taken, General. Now, coming to the last segment before we open up for questions. One of the factors related to the pandemic has been the economic collapses that we are seeing. Practically no country on earth has been spared the economic tsunami. I mean, all of them are in a deep trouble and are looking at the worst results in terms of GDP and employment and poverty levels since the 1930s. This is much worse than even the 2008 global economic crisis. Now, General, I wonder, and some analysts have already started analyzing this, is what will be the impact of these deep economic depressions on defense spending, on acquisition of state-of-the-art equipment and weaponry. Not just, I don't mean just for India, but globally. It seems like governments will be forced to redirect a lot of financial resources away from conventional defense purposes to domestic welfare and cushioning the worst effects of this economic crisis. So is there a danger? For example, now we have a strategic gap with China on almost all conventional aspects, be it Navy, Air Force, or Land Army. Now, is it likely that we will fall further behind China as a result of our inability to finance? Already there has been a worrying trend of the last few years where the defense spending has gone down. It's below 2% of GDP. So my question is the COVID-19 actually going to be a big setback for hardware acquisition, for being more updated with the latest weapons technology, with R&D, with manufacturing domestically or acquiring weapon system from overseas? Are we actually going to be in a bigger cash crunch? And is that going to make our national security worse as a result of this in the next 5 to 10 years? Because you cannot have the egg, you cannot have the cake and eat it too here, because clearly finite resources of a state, and right now the public health and the social welfare demands are mushrooming like anything, so the bailouts and the cushioning and the safety nets. So it looks like the economists are going to get the big chunk of whatever resources we have, rather than the militaries or the intelligence agencies. So and this may even apply to cyber warfare and other arenas, or even outer space. So I'm just wondering whether this is a big setback as a whole for the national security establishments, and how will they cope in the post-COVID era of austerity?
I think you've already covered most of it. that India, as it is, the allocation for defense, despite whatever spin may have been given from strategic experts to military experts, we all have felt that our defense budget in GDP terms, as a percentage of GDP, has been reducing. Obviously, the government has other concerns. I mean, they have to look at the socio-economic dimension. There are so many other tasks that await the budget. And therefore, in their wisdom, they had allocated a certain amount, and now there has been a hold on that. Obviously, it is going to affect the pace of our modernization. Now, let's look at the budget in two parts. One is the revenue budget. And that revenue budget looks at salaries and the day-to-day running operations of the army. I don't think there is any cut in the revenue budget, and therefore, the operational effectiveness of the army as it stands today will be supported by the revenue budget. The crunch is going to come, and which was already there because of committed liabilities were taking away a chunk of our capital budget, and that is further going to be curtailed. Not only curtailed, there will be a slowdown in the equipment and modernization weaponry that is going to come. Rafale, for example, was supposed to land up in the month of May, and there is a delay in that. But I don't think this is, well, this is a concern, but I don't think there is an emergency, because the basic wherewithal to undertake the defensive tasks that India has in mind is there. And the armed forces, the Army, Navy, Air Force, are quite confident that they will not allow a big void to come in. But what I would like to point out is, I think let's look at, and maybe you can end by summarizing this. How would a post-COVID-19 world look like? A lot of predictions are being made that so-and-so thing will happen. I mean, I read a thing yesterday that based on history, the balkanization of China is probably going to be slated in the next, like it happened to the Soviet Union. Nobody could believe it. But let me say three critical points. One is the globalized and interlinked world with interdependent supply chains has unraveled overnight. And I think there will be a pushback against globalization. And virtually it has come to a state in the initial parts of the pandemic. You saw when the Italians reached out, there were very few people to support them, even within the European Union. And therefore, it has become to each his own, each for himself. So I think there will be a pushback there. The international world organizations, which have stood right from World War II onwards, the UN, the WHO, have not been able to rise to the occasion. In fact, WHO has come under controversy itself for trying to cover up for, like the Americans openly say, for covering up for China. And India is going to assume this leadership in the WHO. And there will be a pushback. Our diplomacy will be quite tested. A lot of people say that the United States is probably on the verge of losing its superpower status. I don't know if that is true, but there is certainly one fact that cannot be denied, that in the COVID-19 crisis, the world has not been looking at United States for leadership as it has looked for all major crises. If you look post-World War, the American supremacy has been established internationally by persuasion or by threat or by use of force. But over the years, especially the response during the COVID-19 crisis and the expeditions which they have mounted, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, at best a status quo result. I mean, they're going to leave Afghanistan after 3 decades, almost at status quo on terms of the Taliban, has certainly weakened an impression of American competence. Combined with the rise of China, there are all kinds of issues, but I think it will be premature to write off the United States. That is one nation whose depth in terms of technology, economics, and military is so extensive that I think it is rather premature to talk of this. But coming to China, a lot of people are also saying that the rise of China, while the rest of the world, China has recovered and almost resumed normal activity, while the rest of the world is in lockdown and focused totally on the pandemic. So the centrality and the preeminent position of China is being seen as a replacement for the United States. I think that also, it's too early to take a firm position on that, because there will be, China is on a rough road. There will be a pushback from America and the Western nations. And the Chinese are trying their best to cover up. And I think they are facing problems even on their pet projects like the BRI, as nation after nation realizes the severe debt trap they are walking into.
Yes, General.
The lesson for, I just wanted to cover.
No, that's a good segue, and I want to also request the audience who are watching to please send in the questions. We are waiting for it. I am able to see questions so that we can also respond. But on the transformed world order, sir, my analysis is always based on a differentiation between capabilities and will. See, these are two different things. So if you look at the material capabilities, then surely both the US and China still have enormous, economic and military means to be able to project power and to, influence different regions of the world. No doubt about it. But in the US case, as my book Trump has laid out, there is a severe loss of political will to be able to exert themselves internationally, both in institutions as well as different regions of the world, as in like different hotspots and so on. So I think to maintain a superpower status, you need a combination of both capabilities and will to be able to. Right now, the US is sorely lacking, and I think that the COVID-19 is going to make them more inward in the sense, because the losses are so staggering, and Trump has already said, as we do this show, I think there are 70,000 deaths or more, and Trump has already said that 100,000 or more are likely. So we are looking at a catastrophe, a human catastrophe unfolding there. And I think the accounting for it in terms of the polarization and the politics, they have an election coming up in November. I think they're going to be more and more divided and distracted from the global, power politics and playing the, the geopolitical role of the hegemon. So that is going to be, I think, missing for some time. Of course, they have the military and the economy, but I think that's not enough. As far as Chinese go, yeah, please.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, as far as the Chinese go, my feeling is that they will not be able to really recover from the pandemic-induced fall for some time. I mean, they have restarted factories and offices, and they're saying they've controlled the virus. They've stamped it out, they say. But the dependence of the Chinese growth on manufacturing and on exports is tremendous. So their ability to generate the surpluses, the foreign exchange reserves and surpluses, which are the highest in the world, depend a lot on this export, mechanisms functioning. And right now, with most of their main export markets like Europe and North America totally, raised to the ruins, I doubt very much if they actually will eke out any positive growth this year. I mean, Chinese growth is going to be the lowest in 40 years since Mao's death. So I think it's going to be a slow recovery for them. And that will impact on the BRI allocations too, because BRI is supposed to be more than $1 trillion of overseas investments and commitments. I doubt if the Chinese will, in the current crisis, or at least for the foreseeable future, be able to do the same. But like we discussed before, they are not hesitating to flex their muscle in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea or in the Pacific. They are investing in those kinds of things. They are not cutting back, even though they are going through dire straits, on what they consider to be their core sovereignty issues and so on, and where they want to impose their will on smaller countries in Asia. But I think their role in Africa, their role in Latin America, where they used to be #1 through aid and through checkbook diplomacy and all that, I think they're going to struggle to sustain that. So my own view is that neither the Chinese nor the US will be able to determine the world order for the foreseeable future, because we are looking at, I think, a more dispersed and diffuse kind of power, which may not be a bad thing because it gives an opportunity for rising states, emerging powers like India, to carve out a more independent zone and a bigger zone of influence ourselves, especially in the developing countries. But as far as the national security goes, it's worth asking whether I think it's fair to say the country which is least affected economically, or let's say less damaged economically from COVID-19, is likely to be able to sustain a more aggressive and proactive national security stance. The countries which are going to be more in deeper economic misery for a longer period of time, I think will take a longer time to be able to push back. So to come back to the national security element, and we're waiting for questions from the audience. I think the world order question general, which you raised, is very central, because end of the day, national security does not operate in a vacuum. Every state fashions its strategy vis-a-vis how the rest of the world is positioned. So clearly, this is a time of great flux, and we all need to rethink our basic, assumptions, where we thought that this was a superpower, this is a superpower, we are somewhere in the middle. Well, I don't know. Now it's hard to say who is a superpower, because in terms of the soft power as well as the influence in different regions of the world, it looks like nobody is any longer numero uno or most dominant.
I think that's a very fair and comprehensive assessment, Sriram, that you have given. But let me come back to India. How does India look at the future? I think we face a big dilemma as well, because there is so many competing requirements. Defense, of course, requires a major chunk of our GDP, and I think the more we give would probably still not be enough. So the government will have to do a tight walk. But we require to ratchet up our investments and funding for health and education. Our health funding in this budget was just 1% or just 1.some% of our GDP, where the stated aim of the government is to give 2.5%. As far as education is concerned, from 4.some%, 4.5% in 2015, we have come down to 3.4% of GDP this year. Yeah, in overall terms, the money may have grown, but there is inflation and so many other things that happen. Secondly, we will have to set our house in order. I think if we are to assume our rightful role in the world affairs, we cannot have domestic distractions of the magnitude that we are seeing today. Virtually every month there is a new issue that crops up. And I think here we would require sagacious and enlightened leadership at the political level, not just the government, but the opposition as well. Internal strife weakens the country. I think that this is a lesson to be learned. And I think once India manages to set its house in order, our second focus should be the countries in the immediate neighborhood and the countries in the strategic neighborhood. And I think we have already started helping them out to the best of our ability. This is the time when we need to reach out to them and help them. They'll not forget that. I think India requires very nimble and sure-footed diplomacy, and requires sagacious leadership, which we have at the moment, but I'm talking of the complete political spectrum, not just the government. Because it's not just the government's role, it's the role of the whole polity who actually define the way India is going to grow and move in the future. I think we can take on any questions that people may have.
The audience should know that General A.K. Singh, after retiring from the Indian Army, also served as Lieutenant Governor of Andaman. It's a very strategically important part of the Indian Ocean, important territory of India, and very crucial for our Act East. And he, as he has also been a civilian administrator in that sense after leaving the army. So his point about the domestic polity and the social order are well taken, because he's an astute observer of that too. I have not been able to see any questions from the audience, but before we conclude, maybe it makes sense, General, to have a final word on this whole issue of the national security and whether we are all saying that the COVID-19 has made globalization less tenable and is moving us back in a way towards earlier era where the national sovereignty and the state-centric definition of the world order is going to be more important than this whole interdependence and liberal trade and commerce and all these things. So it seems like the onus is back on the state. That much is clear. Everywhere the people are not looking up to World Health Organization, people are not looking up to United Nations, people are not even looking up to regional organizations for help. Largely and primarily in this crisis, the average people are all saying, what can my government do for me? Right? And so in that sense, the responsibility is more on the shoulders of the state. And I think the states, as we have discussed today, need to be rethinking their or maybe expanding their notion of national security and including human security and all these terms, as well as the terms, some of the new concepts like gray zone and hybrid and all these things, and how we can respond to these threats, both in the high seas, in our exclusive waters, and on the borders. And then the next layer is within our society, deep inside the society, in our own territorial limits. So it looks like this is a time for all of us to think seriously about it. And General, I would like you to have the last word before we close the show.
Sriram, it's always difficult to have the last word when you are present, because your profound knowledge of world affairs is so extensive that one is a fan of that. Well, I just want to end by 2 points. One is that India boasts of great technological prowess, even though we have been slow at privatizations and a public sector dominated it for long. But I think we haven't seen the nimbleness and the innovation that is so necessary. There have been glimpses. There are young startups who have quickly turned. They were trying to produce some defense equipment. They've quickly turned to start producing PPE and masks and things like that. But you see the greatness of America, which tilted everything, and which the Japanese admiral actually told his government, don't start off anything with America. Says when this giant turns, I think one of the main contributors to the victory was the way their industrial technological complex turned from making consumer products to making military hardware, producing thousands and thousands of tanks. The best car factories started producing tanks. Here we are still struggling to produce our first tank. So I think there is a technical mission that is required to upgrade ourselves. The knowledge is there, the temperament is there, but I know something is holding us back. That is the first thing. Second, I want to end by stating that the country needs to be assured that their armed forces have a very good grip on national security issues, whether it be external threats or internal challenges. And I think you can rest assured that they will come up to the desired requirement whenever any new threat or challenges, because in the armed forces, I'm sure, and I'm privy also to that they always look to contingencies of the future. Maybe this kind of pandemic may not have been thought of in the kind of detail. I know in perspective planning, we did look at biological warfare. There is a section that looks at NBC, a nuclear, biological, chemical. Of course, our focus was more on the nuclear because India had just done the tests and things like that. But as the gray zone and hybrid warfare threat is concerned, I think the Indian armed forces are well on their way. But yes, a certain amount of realignment may be required, even in the way that we prepare our capabilities for the future. And you know, India faces a very unique challenge. A lot of people used to ask me, General, why are we buying so many tanks? Why are we buying so many aircraft? Because the wars that we are fighting are of the proxy war, hybrid warfare, counterinsurgency variety. My answer was that those traditional threats have not abated. We still have border issues on our northern borders as well as on the west. We have inimical neighbors. Certainly the western one will not fail to take advantage. And therefore, what is holding the peace up beyond the threshold is our capability. So we cannot diminish our capability. But certainly there has to be a realignment of our doctrine, realignment of our strategy, and realignment of our capability development. And I'm sure the armed forces hierarchy are already looking at this.
Thank you, General A.K. Singh, for sharing deep thoughts. I think we should, put these forward to policymakers and continue the debate among the general public who are interested in matters of national security. Indeed, self-reliance, it seems, is the new game in town, not interdependence. We cannot be reliant on China for masks or for protective equipment. So it's very, very telling that in the present health crisis has maybe awoken us for indigenous manufacturing. General A.K. Singh made that important point. We are still far away, be it civilian goods as or military. We still are significantly dependent on external sources, and this crisis made us maybe rethink the comfortable assumption that we can always rely on this country or that country for our meeting our needs. I think we need to move more in towards indigenous self-reliance in all fields, and that is probably the big message that will define national security in the years and possibly decades to come. And hopefully we will learn from this health crisis and see the connections between the health crisis and national security, and do not neglect the national security because at present it is COVID-19, because COVID-19 will eventually one day be gone, but the national security challenges are as General A.K. Singh was mentioning, the conventional threats, not to mention the non-conventional ones like terrorist groups and cyber attacks remain. So no room for complacency, to forget or to neglect national security. So thank you, General A.K. Singh. Thank you, sir. It's been a wonderful discussion with you. Thank you, audience, for joining us. And we will see you again another dialogue soon. Thank you on behalf of the Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you very much.
Welcome.